Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from a channel called Holy Land Site, which purports to explain where the water went after Noah's flood. It's been a hot minute since I've done a straight up Noah's flood video, so I thought I'd give it a go. It's a bit of a longer one, and it is quite dramatized, so I will be skipping large segments of it, and depending on how things go, I might even take it in 2 parts. So let's go! But first, a word from our sponsor.
Okay, sitting in my favorite coffee shop, ready to start writing my book. Let's go.
Here's your tea, and here's your ball gag, banana, and a pack of matches.
Wait, all I ordered was the tea. What's with all that other stuff?
Well, you don't use Surfshark when you're connected to my router here at the coffee shop, so I'm able to see a log of all the websites that you visit while you're connected to my public Wi-Fi network. I've seen things that cannot be unseen.
What's Surfshark?
Surfshark is a VPN, or virtual private network. It keeps your data private by encrypting all the information sent between your device and the internet, meaning that if you had thought to use it, then I wouldn't be able to access even your most basic data, like which websites you keep visiting, keeping it private and secure. It's always a good idea to use a VPN for some extra security, especially on public networks.
Is that all it does? I mostly browse at home, so I generally don't have to worry about snoopy coffee shop owners like you.
It can also be used to unblock geo-restricted content, allowing you to watch Netflix or other streaming services using a different country's library. And in addition to all that, their Clean Web feature blocks ads, trackers, malware, and phishing attempts, letting you browse the web safely and securely.
That's a lot of features. Surely that must cost a fortune.
Not at all. Rhino viewers can pick it up with a special offer today by visiting my URL in the video description and using promo code Rhino at checkout, which will get them 83% off the regular price and 3 extra months for free. And this is all risk-free. It's backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you don't like it, you can get a full no-hassle refund.
Okay, just one last question. You knew enough to bring out the ball gag, banana, and matches, so why didn't you also bring out the big—
Sir, please, there are other customers here. I wouldn't bring that out in front of polite company. Surfshark, because we really don't want to know what you did with that banana. So what were the matches even for?
Okay, so hear me out. First thing you do is you take the banana, put it in your mouth, then you keep it in there with the ball gag. Then you take the matches, you light one, and then you stick that—
The story of Noah's Ark is one of the most fascinating and intriguing stories known to mankind.
Yeah, that's a bit of a stretch. It certainly is fascinating and intriguing from a cultural and historical context, where we can learn a lot about the cultures that wrote the 2 stories that were eventually fused into the one somewhat broken narrative that we know today by studying it and comparing it with the earlier Babylonian myth that it was based on. But if we're taking it literally at face value, then it's probably the most boring way anyone could possibly tell a story of a genocidal, rage-filled god killing all life on the planet except for his chosen few.
It can be found in virtually 200 different accounts all around the world and on almost every continent.
No, it really can't. I mean, sure, there are a bunch of flood myths all over the world, for some reason concentrated in geographical areas that are subject to flooding, fancy that, but the details are so different that you can't really say that they are all based on the Noah's Ark myth. And even if you could, the Epic of Gilgamesh is very clearly the story that formed the basis for the development of the Noah's Ark story, with Utnapishtim playing the part of Noah. So, if you want to claim that all of the stories are different versions of the one original flood story, then the flood that you have to end up believing in is Utnapishtim's flood.
However, many people today believe Noah's Ark and the Great Flood are just myths.
Mostly because they are. It is literally impossible for such a flood to have occurred as described. Now, it is possible that there are stories that have their basis in a real flood that happened about 7,500 years ago. What happened then is that, as the glaciers from the last glaciation period were retreating, the flow of meltwater diverted to the North Sea and left the Black Sea without a source of replenishment, creating much more dry land in the area than there was previously. This then created a situation where there was a dry basin several hundred feet lower than the Mediterranean Sea, as sea levels were continuing to rise. Eventually, the Mediterranean rose to a point where it overflowed into this basin, causing rapid and quite catastrophic flooding. Of course, as catastrophic as it was local, not global. but to the people living there at the time, it may as well have been global. So naturally, survivors would have started telling stories of that time when their whole world was flooded. Time and the telephone game turned this into the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, with more time and telephone gaming turning it into Noah's Ark.
How did the flood change the Earth's climate? The Bible and geology support that before the flood, there was a water canopy above the earth that caused a greenhouse-like effect on the whole earth.
Nope, that sure as fuck is not what geology supports. The Bible can certainly be interpreted that way, sure, but most creationists have abandoned canopy theory because it creates a whole slew of extra physics problems that make the entire thing completely impossible. To quote Answers in Genesis on the matter, the pitfalls of the canopy model have grown to such an extent that most researchers have abandoned the model. For example, if a canopy existed and collapsed at the time of the flood to supply rainfall, the latent heat of condensation would have boiled the atmosphere, and a viable canopy would not have had enough water vapor in it to sustain 40 days and nights of torrential global rain. Of course, both of these are still issues for the flood no matter where you say the water comes from, so it's interesting that they chose to listen to the scientific feedback for one aspect of the flood and change their models accordingly, but they refuse to see that the same issues that demonstrate that the vapor canopy model is impossible also apply to the flood itself. As noted creationist geophysicist John Baumgartner pointed out in a paper in 1990 that demonstrated the impossibility of Noah's flood, creationists just need to get more comfortable with ignoring the fact that their model violates all the laws of physics and just say God did it using magic when they find science that doesn't support creationism. Obviously, that's a paraphrase, but that essentially is what he said, though he dressed it up in language that tried to be more sympathetic to creationism, since he's a creationist.
Therefore, it appears that before the flood, the earth was like a huge greenhouse that was tropical in nature worldwide.
This actually is a creationist talking point that all the creationist organizations still use. It was warmer before the flood, with more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as well as more oxygen, and that's why we find fossils of giant insects and tropical plants in places that are currently rather chilly. They take the geological evidence of tropical climates existing in locations that would be impossible today, then they ignore the part where this evidence also shows that these climates existed in those locations tens to hundreds of millions of years ago, and try to claim it as a victory for a young Earth. Sorry, but you don't get to cherry-pick science and discard anything that you don't like simply because you don't like it.
The Earth was exposed to the upper atmosphere without a water canopy, causing instant freezing toward the northern and southern poles and the higher elevation mountains. This is evidenced and proven by animals being found frozen instantaneously in ice.
I feel like whoever wrote this just watched The Day After Tomorrow and thought that it sounded scientifically plausible.
The body of this mammoth was found perfectly preserved in the Siberian tundra, with food still in its mouth and stomach, indicating that it froze instantly while grazing.
Well, let me just say that if your scientific model happens to be in high agreement with the science found in a disaster movie by Roland Emmerich, your scientific model is anything but scientific.
Now, where did all the water go after the flood?
Excellent question. It can't just have disappeared because that's not how anything works, well, unless God magicked it away. But yeah, all this water fell down from the vapor canopy onto the earth, flooding it entirely, and then just seemingly poofed away.
God says in Genesis 7:19 that the water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered.
Okay, but we've established in your worldview that the water came from the vapor canopy, so saying that the water covered the mountains doesn't tell us where it went when it was done covering the mountains.
This means there were high mountains, and all of them on the entire earth were covered with water.
Yes, and that is a huge issue. You see, most creationists will claim that mountains like Everest were formed in the flood, so it was just the smaller hills and mountains that we have to worry about. But even raising the sea levels the measly 5 kilometers that it takes to get to the top of Mount Ararat would require 7 times the total amount of water on the planet, including all the water vapor in the air and melting all the ice. And remember that latent heat problem that Answers in Genesis agrees would cause the vapor canopy model to boil away the atmosphere? Well, guess what? It applies here even without the vapor canopy. Having that much water rain down on the planet over the course of just 40 days would have rendered the entire planet completely inhospitable to life, even if it was contained on a wooden boat smaller than the Titanic. I ran the numbers in a bit more detail in a video that I'll leave a link to, so go ahead and give that a watch.
Now, where did all this water go? We basically have four options. 1. The Earth's continents, ocean valleys, and mountains slowly changed over the 274 days after the Great Deluge so that the water settled in the lower elevations of the Earth.
Well, that's completely ridiculous. So, just to hammer that out, you're saying that the floodwaters didn't actually go anywhere, the land just completely reshaped itself in what would actually have been an incredibly rapid couple of 100 days. Well, in order for that to work, not only do we still have the issue of how much heat energy the rain itself would have brought down on the Earth, we now have a bunch of energy being released by the tectonic activity that would definitely render the entire Earth a molten ball, as described by John Baumgartner. And in order to get a bunch of land showing up above the water when it wasn't sufficient before, the mass of the Earth itself would need to be increased. So now we not only have to figure out where the water for the flood came from, we need to figure out where all the extra rock came from to allow the Earth to have a bigger circumference, allowing for dry land again.
2. The water that had come from the fountains of the deep from below the Earth's surface returned to their original place under the Earth during this 274 days.
This is probably where the more reasonable creationists will go, with an appeal to the existence of a mineral in the Earth's mantle called ringwoodite. The formation of ringwoodite involves immense pressure that breaks water molecules down into hydroxyl radicals, which are then absorbed into the pores in the ringwoodite. One of the problems with this is that it still doesn't leave us with enough water. Given how much water is contained in ringwoodite, and how much ringwoodite is in the transition zone of the Earth's mantle, that would essentially double the amount of water that is available on the surface. But to cover up Mount Ararat, we needed 7 times the amount of water available on the surface, so that doesn't quite get us there. And of course there's the additional problem, as the way you get the water out of the ringwoodite is not just to open up a hole down to the ringwoodite and then water gushes out. It comes out of volcanoes in lava, so this isn't liquid water we're dealing with here. And for more information on this, I'll leave another link to another one of my videos that deals with this subject in a bit more detail.
3. In the same way God creates, he can, in a sense, uncreate.
Magic. God magicked the water away. I guess credit where it's due, this is at least an intellectually honest answer. Rather than twist the science to make it sort of fit what you want it to fit, just shrug and say magic.
And 4, a combination of the first 3 could have all taken place simultaneously.
And that is the most intellectually dishonest option. Where the science agrees, we'll go with the science. But as soon as there's some evidence that's incompatible with my pre-drawn conclusions, that's when it's magic.
God is supernatural and can do anything he wants. He is not bound to natural laws. In fact, he created all the natural laws.
And this is why any hypothesis that involves a god is ultimately useless. There is no way that it can be falsified, because anything that doesn't fit can just be hand-waved away as being the result of god magic.
Now, what did Noah do shortly after the Great Flood?
Oh, I know this one. He immediately slaughtered a couple of animals as a sacrifice for God, causing that species to go extinct. Then he planted a vineyard, got drunk, passed out naked, and cursed one of his kids for having seen him while he was passed out naked.
Genesis 8:20 and 21 says, Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every kind of clean animal, and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar.
Okay, I can admit when I was wrong. I thought it was just, 2 animals, but no, he caused several species to go extinct right away, immediately after having gone through that whole ordeal to save them. Well, I suppose this part of the story is from the same source as the one that has him bringing 7 of all the clean animals, so there are extras for a sacrifice, but something tells me that you don't really approve of the idea that there are multiple similar but conflicting stories that are being put together here.
The Lord smelled the soothing aroma and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done.
Okay, did you guys catch that? That verse really speaks to the character of God. God, in a senseless rage, kills everything. And then when he smells burning flesh, that calms him down to the point where he realized how stupid he was behaving, and so he promised to never do it again. And then he invented the refraction of light to remind him not to let his anger get the better of him again. At least not at such a large scale. He still went on plenty of genocidal massacres after that.
And God instituted the rainbow as a promise he would never again destroy those upon the earth with another great flood.
Well, that certainly is how most people interpret that verse. But the way it's worded makes it pretty obvious that the rainbow is the equivalent of strategically placed post-it notes to remind God not to flood the earth again. It's not for us, it's for him.
Now, is there evidence today for the location of Noah's Ark?
No, there is not. And again, all the quote-unquote respectable creationist organizations like to distance themselves from the claims made by people who think they have found it.
The answer is yes. There is overwhelming evidence for the location of Noah's Ark that can be seen today, and I'm really excited to share this with you. The site we'll be looking at has far more evidence than any other proposed place.
And the site that he showed while he said that was a vaguely oval-ish shaped outcropping of rock, as if the boat itself somehow decayed away and rocks grew in the shape of a boat to replace it? And for what it's worth, the bit that he has labeled as boat-shaped object looks more like a vulva than a boat, though really it doesn't look much like that either. Also, the rocks that are in the boat shape have been examined. They are mostly a type of iron ore, not exactly gopher wood. There was also fossiliferous limestone deposits that cross-cut the structure, which, given the flood model, means that if this is Noah's Ark, it had to have sunk in the flood in order for the younger limestone deposits to end up cross-cutting its structure. So, sure, we can call this Noah's Ark if you don't think the Ark actually made it through the flood, but then how do humans exist? Did God do a second Adam and Eve and just tell the authors of the Pentateuch to skip over that bit? And this is a site that he says has more evidence than any other proposed site. Great.
It's known today as the Drupanar site, but it is not new as it has been venerated for thousands of years.
Okay, for this you're not even getting the pseudoscience right. Those aren't stones that were carved for veneration of the site. Those are stones that were supposedly used by Noah as drogue stones, stones that would essentially act as anchors for the ship. Tie the ship to the stone, drop the stone in the water during a storm, and the ship will then be forced to face into the wind and oncoming waves, making it safer. The problem is, geologists have identified them as being made of local rock, which means that they wouldn't have traveled there with Noah from ancient Mesopotamia. There are also similar stones scattered all throughout the area, which have been identified as originally being part of a pagan worship cult, with later Christians carving crosses and other Christian imagery onto them and using them for Christian worship.
Then we have the actual Noah's Ark boat location shape here.
It's a rock vagina, not a boat.
Noah's Ark Visitor Center.
Oh, well, excuse me. If they built a visitor center there, it must be true. There's no way they would just want to make a quick buck off tourists who think it's the Ark. They only build visitor centers for things that are really, really true.
Drogue and anchor stones.
Yeah, those are the pagan worship stones that later Christians carved crosses on. Are you suggesting that Noah was carving crosses on all his drogue stones because he knew the importance of Christian symbolism 2,000 years before Christianity existed?
Ancient stones with carvings, ancient relics and objects.
I mean, you found a site with ancient carvings, relics, and objects. Unless you are actually saying what these things are, that means nothing. For all I know, those are just more pagan artifacts that happen to be in the general vicinity of a big vulva-shaped rock formation that some people think is Noah's Ark instead for some reason. Did I mention that the rock formation isn't even the right dimensions for the Ark? It's about the right length, but it is much too wide. Now, I'm skipping the rest of this part. It's rubbish of the kind that not even Answers in Genesis can get behind. If I can debunk your claims using Answers in fucking Genesis as a source, they aren't worth taking seriously in the first place.
And historical eyewitness accounts dating back thousands of years who claim to have seen the remains of Noah's Ark.
Okay, eyewitness accounts. Now we're getting somewhere. Well, let's look at Berosus. His account of the flood has a main character named Xisuthros, who makes an ark that was roughly 10 times the length of Noah's Ark, being a kilometer long compared to Noah's 100 meters, and 400 meters wide compared to Noah's 30. So, if this guy was an eyewitness, he witnessed something a lot bigger than what the Bible claims. Also, he never actually claims to be a witness. The relevant quote is, "To this day, a small part of the ship that came to rest in Armenia remains in the Gordanian Mountains in Armenia, and some people go there and scrape pieces of pitch to keep them as good luck charms." So he doesn't claim to have seen the site himself, he just knows that people claim to have scrapings of pitch from the ark that they keep as good luck charms. And obviously the only place to get pitch is from a boat that survived a worldwide flood. The Josephus passage is, again, just saying that some people claim to know where the ark is, and he supports this by quoting Berosus, and even goes so far as to specify that the mountain that the ark was on was a refuge where many people escaped the deluge, leading one to believe that such a flood did not, in fact, cover all the high mountains. And he goes through what I am now learning is an even older creationist trope than I thought. He lists a bunch of other cultures that have flood myths as being evidence for Noah's flood, even when the details don't match up.
Now let's look at some faith lessons we can learn from Noah's Ark.
Lesson 1. Do as God says, or he'll murder you, everyone you know and love, and everyone else for good measure. Lesson 2. If one of your kids ever sees you passed out drunk, God will let you curse them and all their descendants with being slaves to their siblings and their siblings' descendants. Lesson 3. God is apparently powerful enough to create everything from scratch once, but not a second time, so he had to work some TARDIS magic to save all the animals that he apparently could no longer create from scratch. Lesson 4. A 600-year-old man built a ship out of wood all by himself, so your 93-year-old grandfather is lazy for needing a walker. Tell him to get back to work in the shop. Lesson 5. Genocide is good and makes for excellent children's books and movies. What great lessons we're getting here. Need I go on?
So the first faith lesson is, do we truly believe the biblical account of Noah and the ark and the great flood?
That's not a lesson that is taught, that's a question that is answered. And the answer for me is a resounding no. This is one of the Bible stories that not only is there no evidence for it, but there is actually a plethora of evidence against it. If God really did it and used miracles to accomplish it, he went out of his way to perform these miracles in such a way as to make it obvious that the whole event never happened in the first place. Call that a test of faith, if you will, but if that's what he's doing with that, then God's a dick.
Now today there's a raging battle taking place between those who want to eliminate a literal account of the creation of the universe and the great flood accounts as found in Genesis 1 through 8.
It wouldn't be much of a battle if you actually had evidence to back up your claim. If the evidence pointed to a universe that was only 6,000 years old, we would teach that the universe is only 6,000 years old. But as it stands, we literally just started getting images back from a telescope that is expected to be able to peer back in time 13.7 billion years, and the pictures we have show thousands to millions of entire galaxies that are all billions of light years away. We wouldn't be able to see any of this if the universe were only 6,000 years old. And sure, you can claim that God made the universe with the photons already in transit so that it didn't take billions of years to reach us, or whatever. After all, the Bible does say that the heavens declare the glory of God. But I can't help but look at pictures like this, realize that the entire picture represents a segment of the sky that is about the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length, and think that the universe is so much bigger and more impressive than the God described by the Bible could ever hope to be. We're expected to look at this vast and wondrous collection of galaxies in such a small portion of the sky, realize that we are completely surrounded by similar sights in every direction that you could think to look, and then think that the being who created all of that actually gives a shit what you do with your penis? What a small, petty God for such a vast and wondrous universe.
The battle is between those who attempt to explain every earthly event by using only the natural laws of nature. In other words, they eliminate the existence of God and the supernatural. Therefore, they are only left with natural explanations for everything that occurred in the past.
I mean, yeah. If you open the door to magic when you can't describe any of the mechanisms by which magic would operate, then you basically stop scientific progress, because obviously anything we don't understand can be dismissed as being caused by magic. Sorry, buddy, but we've never discovered any new things about the world and how it works by appealing to the supernatural. We only ever do that when we exclude the supernatural. So at the very least, the most practical course of action is to act as though the supernatural does not exist, because it doesn't appear to.
Now, God tells us that the answer to these apparent dilemmas is faith, that we should believe God, even though we maybe don't understand all the details.
God disapproves of curiosity. Got it.
However, it's not a blind trust because there's evidence everywhere that supports the fact that God did create. We see intelligent design everywhere.
No, the evidence literally points to the exact opposite of that. So not only is it a blind faith, it is a counter-intellectual faith. You believe these things in spite of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and if you actually had evidence supporting your position, you wouldn't need to call it faith and appeal to God's miraculous ability to break the laws of physics in order to make your worldview make sense. You'd just be able to appeal to the actual evidence.
Everywhere you look, you see intelligent design in everything.
Nope, you do not. I actually had a discussion with my daughter last night about the so-called balance of nature. You see, it's easy to fall into this idea that humans are a scourge on the planet, creating destruction everywhere we go. Because we kinda do. But that's not all we do. The thing about nature is that pretty much everything lives in a state of near death. If there's ever enough for all the individuals of a species to eat, then those individuals will eat it and breed themselves to a point where their offspring are now back to struggling to get enough to eat, with plenty of them starving to death along the way. That's how nature achieves balance, through struggle and suffering and death. Humans, for all the bad that we do, also have a number of animals in our care, from pets to zoo animals to animals on preserves and more, where we make sure that they have enough to eat and don't have to worry about being killed by something else every moment of every day. Does this balance out the bad that we've done to natural ecosystems and the planet in general? I'd argue that not even a little bit, no. But it is a more complicated calculation than it may seem at first. Now, my point in bringing this all up is that a god that is supposed to be all-loving has seemingly designed a system that maintains balance through immeasurable suffering, and that doesn't even seem very intelligently designed. And, of course, that's without even getting into the design flaws like our broken vitamin C gene, the backbone that seems designed for quadrupedal walking, ear muscles that seem designed for swiveling our notably unswivelable ears, etc., etc.
Additionally, God says that without faith, it is impossible to please God.
Exactly. So he set up a system where you have to believe in him without any evidence, otherwise he'll be totally pissed that you didn't believe in him.
Mankind's problem is that they trust in their own intelligence and beliefs rather than trusting God.
Yeah, that's right. Our problem is that we trust in things that can be verified to actually exist, rather than the words of a book written by people who thought that the Earth was flat, and the reason it rained was because there's a big ocean in the sky above the firmament, and sometimes God opens the windows of the firmament to let in some water, something that we know from our ability to launch rockets into the sky is not true. And yeah, most modern creationists will not like that picture of the biblical cosmology, but that is what you get when you take Genesis 1 literally, which they insist is something that you have to do. It also matches closely with the cosmologies of the other ancient Near Eastern cultures, so our options are that the ancient Hebrews believed the things that were similar to the beliefs of other people who lived in the same time and place as them, or that they actually knew the reality of the cosmos but chose to describe it in a way that makes one picture the cosmology of their neighbors instead of actually being an accurate portrayal.
Now, the Bible actually says that unbelief is a sin.
Yep. Believe in God, and specifically the young Earth creationist version of God, otherwise, God will burn you in hell forever. Seems perfectly reasonable.
Second, do we understand why God sent the Great Flood to begin with?
Because he was mad at people for being how he made them, obviously. Or, depending on who you ask, because a bunch of angels had babies with humans, and somehow every single human on the planet, except for Noah, his wife, his sons, and his sons' wives, were the offspring of such union. So it was okay to genocide them. Of course, this then leaves us with the question of why God made angels genetically compatible with humans in the first place. Seems like a pretty bad idea if you don't actually want them to breed, but I digress.
The purpose of the Great Flood was to destroy all the wicked people on the earth.
And the wicked people apparently included babies who hadn't yet developed object permanence, much less a capacity for moral philosophy. Also, according to modern right-wing evangelicals, a fertilized egg is a completely separate individual person, so quote-unquote people who hadn't even grown a brain yet were somehow completely wicked.
Now, while this might sound cruel, it is actually an exercise of God's mercy and justice.
Nothing says merciful and just quite like the most thorough genocide the world has ever seen.
Sin causes heartache and suffering. When sin reaches such a severe state, then God will step in and eliminate.
Did you miss the verse about God's covenant with Noah? He basically says straight up that the flood solved nothing. Everyone is still and always will be wicked. And since genocide didn't solve the problem, I won't do it again. The flood failed in its purpose, and God admitted as much. The God who created everything in the James Webb images and beyond couldn't even solve the simple problem of beings he created being the way he created them instead of the way he wanted them to be.
This is what he did with the flood. This is what he did with Sodom and Gomorrah, with the Canaanite nation that the Israelites drove out. When sin reaches such a high state, severe state, then God will step in and eliminate. And that's actually an act of mercy because sin brings death and destruction.
Pro tip: if your religion has you justifying multiple genocides, consider switching religions to one that is less obviously evil.
And we also believe that children who are under the age of accountability, they go to heaven, so they are saved from all this life of destruction as well.
So then abortion must be a good thing, because those babies never even get a chance to sin. It's just skipping a life of suffering and pain and going straight into heaven. Yet something tells me that this man who is justifying genocide and the murdering of children and babies is actually against abortion, despite having just explained why Christians should not only be supportive of abortion, but actively and enthusiastically encouraging more abortions.
Also, we need to realize that our time on earth is very, very brief. It's just a speck of time, and we're all going to die eventually, so it's not really that drastic if someone dies younger rather than older. In the grand scheme of time, it's not that big of a thing.
I really did not expect this video to take such a dark turn. This dude's just saying the quiet part out loud. In the past, I've had to essentially put a bunch of clues together to come to the conclusion that Christians, like this guy, are treating mortal life as a disposable practice run for what will be the real life up in eternity. But nope, this dude just comes out and says it straight up. But also, in your worldview, everyone who was above the age of accountability when the flood happened went to spend eternity in hell. Would the merciful action in that case not have been to allow them to enjoy the rest of their earthly life before torturing them for eternity? After all, on the grand scale of things, it's such a small thing to grant. But nope. I mean, really, the more humane option that God could have taken here would be to just make everyone except for Noah and his family sterile, then all the same people end up dead with no children to take their place, humanity gets its reboot, and we don't have to worry about fitting all the animals on an unreasonably small boat being tended to by 8 people for a year. Like, that's so unreasonable that even the Ark Encounter feels the need to have at least 7 zookeepers for just 200 animals. It'd be a lot easier to believe that God made everyone incapable of reproducing once 4,000 years ago than that he broke a bunch of the laws of physics to flood them all to death. I mean, the evidence still would point to that never having happened because there is no sign of a genetic bottleneck of that scale at that time in our genome, but that's one minor hurdle to overcome rather than having to fight with all of geology, paleontology, archaeology, etc. Wait, no, they'd still be fighting with archaeology because of all the civilizations that survived through that time period that weren't in the ancient Near East. Okay, it would still be completely unreasonable, but less completely than the flood.
And I should mention there are many even Christians today who are leaning towards different beliefs regarding the first 8 chapters of Genesis.
Indeed, there are many Christians who have not made fighting against scientific progress and discovery their life's mission. All else being equal, the world would be a better place if all Christians were like them instead of being fundamentalists. I'd rather have a world full of Megan Lewises than Steve Andersons. Any day. It's just an objectively better place that way.
They're tending to want to interpret those as figurative or as day-age theories, a lot of time between the days of creation, etc. Why? Because they're falling prey to what appears to be the evidence and the beliefs of the evolutionist.
They don't believe in young Earth creationism because they are falling prey to the evidence. Just let that sink in. And that's it for this one. Guess there was enough fluff that I managed to get through it in one go. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Out of the Box Thinker, who says, "That 97% figure is a lie. Unlike with creationism versus evolutionism issue, there is no scientific consensus on climate change. There's only a political consensus that is enforced with actual censorship. See the lecture Climate Science and the Uncertainty Monster by climatologist Judith Curry on the issues with political consensus." Well, I guess I must be wrong. Let's see. Okay, well, here's a meta-analysis of almost 12,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers, which found that, of the papers that took a position on anthropogenic global warming, 97.2% of them took the position that it is a real phenomenon. And when the climate scientists themselves are directly surveyed with two questions, question one is, when compared with pre-1800s levels, do you think that mean global temperatures have generally risen, fallen, or remained relatively constant? And question two is, do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures? 96.2% of the climate scientists answered generally risen to the first question, and 97.4% of them answered yes to the second question. So when you look at the actual scientific research, about 97% of the papers that have something to say about global warming and its causes agree that it is real and caused by people. And when you ask the researchers directly, about 97% of them agree that it is real and caused by people. But yeah, the consensus is a lie brought about by censorship. Right. Thanks for watching, thanks to Tim Robertson for managing my Patreon, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are these stone vaginas that get mistaken for the boat that is my channel. If you'd like creationists to keep taking photos of your private bits because they think it's a holy site, but not that kind of holy site, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. Don't forget to head to surfshark.deals/Rhino for 83% off a Surfshark subscription, and if for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!